They vanished on Everest, but the camera rolled until the end. The rope around George Mallory's waist was still tied in a perfect bowline knot when they found his body 75 years later. His arms were stretched above his head, fingers frozen mid-grasp, reaching for something that wasn't there. The mountain had mummified him at 26,660 feet, his skin bleached white as paper, his wool clothing still intact, his hobnailed boots still laced. But his eyes were gone, eaten by ravens decades ago, leaving empty sockets that stared at nothing from behind shattered snow goggles. This was the man who had promised his wife he would leave her photograph on the summit of Everest. The photograph was missing from his body. George Mallory was the most famous mountaineer on Earth before anyone had ever climbed Everest. His face sold newspapers across 3 continents. His lectures filled theaters in London, New York, and Sydney. Women fainted when he walked into rooms. Men lined up to shake his hand. He was 37 years old, married to the daughter of a wealthy architect, and teaching at the most prestigious school in England. But every night, he dreamed of a mountain that had never been climbed. Every morning, he woke up planning how to kill it. The question that haunted the world for 8 decades was simple. Did George Mallory and Andrew Irvine reach the summit of Mount Everest on June 8, 1924? 29 years before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay became the first confirmed climbers to do so. The answer was locked inside a vest pocket Kodak camera that disappeared with them into the death zone. Mallory had already failed twice. In 1921, his first expedition couldn't even find a route to the summit. In 1922, 7 Sherpas died in an avalanche on his watch. The British press called him a murderer. The climbing establishment wanted him banned from future expeditions. But Mallory knew something nobody else understood. Everest wasn't just a mountain. It was a war between human will and geological physics. He intended to win. The 1924 expedition was Mallory's last chance. At 37, he was already considered old for high-altitude climbing. His knees were destroyed from years of mountaineering. His lungs were scarred from poison gas in World War I. His wife had begged him not to go, but the mountain had become his obsession. He told reporters that he would climb Everest because it's there, a quote that would outlive him by a century. What he didn't tell them was that he planned to die trying. Andrew Irvine was 22 years old and had never climbed a mountain higher than 4,000 feet before joining the Everest expedition. He was an engineering student at Oxford, selected not for his climbing experience but for his mechanical genius. He could fix anything with wire and tape. He could make oxygen equipment work at altitudes where other men's brains shut down. Mallory called him the most natural climber I've ever seen. In 4 months, Irvine would be dead on the world's highest mountain. The oxygen equipment in 1924 was a death trap disguised as salvation. Each tank weighed 30 pounds and contained enough air for 6 hours of climbing. The rubber tubes froze, solid in the cold. The metal regulators jammed with ice. The masks leaked precious oxygen into the thin air. Most climbers threw the equipment away rather than carry the extra weight. But Irvine had modified every piece of gear, making it lighter, more reliable, more efficient. His modifications would keep him and Mallory alive long enough to reach the summit. They would also seal their fate. On June 6, 1924, Mallory and Irvine established their final camp at 26,800 feet. This was higher than any human had ever slept before. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero. The wind was strong enough to blow a man off the mountain. They had enough food for 2 days, enough fuel for 1 hot meal, and enough oxygen for 12 hours of climbing. Above them, the summit of Everest rose another 200 feet through what climbers called the death zone, where the human body begins eating itself to survive. The last person to see them alive was Noel Odell, a geologist climbing support. At 12:50 p.m. on June 8, 1924, he spotted 2 tiny figures moving upward near the summit. They were climbing faster than should have been possible at that altitude. They were higher than any human had ever climbed before. Then the clouds closed in, and they vanished forever. Odell waited at base camp for 5 days, scanning the mountain with binoculars. But George Mallory and Andrew Irvine had become part of Everest itself. The search began immediately, and never stopped. Every expedition to Everest for the next 75 years looked for traces of the missing climbers. They found pieces of oxygen equipment, scraps of clothing, and mysterious artifacts scattered across the mountain's upper slopes. In 1933, climbers discovered an ice axe at 27,160 feet that belonged to either Mallory or Irvine. The axe was embedded in rock, as if someone had used it to stop a fall. Below the axe, the mountain dropped away into a vertical cliff face that would kill anyone who fell down it. The real breakthrough came in 1975, when a Chinese climber named Wang Hongbao found a body at 26,570 feet. He described it as an English dead, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. The body was lying face down, with a hole in the forehead and flesh missing from the leg. Wang tried to tell Western climbers about his discovery, but the Chinese government forbade him from revealing the exact location. He died in an avalanche 4 years later, taking the secret with him to his grave. In 1999, an American expedition called the Mallory and Irvine Research Expedition launched the most systematic search in mountaineering history. They used ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and GPS coordinates to map every inch of Everest's upper slopes. On May 1, 1999, climber Conrad Anker was searching a scree field at 26,760 feet when he noticed something that didn't belong. It was a patch of bleached white skin, perfectly preserved in the ice. He had found George Mallory. The body was lying face down, arms extended upward, as if Mallory had been trying to arrest a fall down the mountain. His rope was still tied around his waist, but the other end was severed, proving that he had been roped to a partner when he died. The rope had snapped with enough force to break a braided line designed to hold 2 tons. His right leg was broken, in multiple places. His ribs were shattered. His skull was fractured. George Mallory had fallen at least 2,000 feet down the north face of Everest, tumbling through rock and ice until the mountain finally stopped him. But the condition of the body told a different story than a simple climbing accident. Mallory's arms were positioned to break his fall, meaning he was conscious when he hit the ground. His snow goggles were in his pocket, not on his eyes, proving he had been climbing in darkness or storm conditions. His oxygen equipment was missing, suggesting he had either discarded it or it had been torn away in the fall. Most mysteriously, his wife's photograph was gone from his pocket, though he had promised to leave it on the summit. The forensic evidence painted a picture of 2 exhausted men pushing beyond human limits in deteriorating conditions. Mallory's body showed signs of severe dehydration and hypothermia. His fingernails were broken and bloody from clawing at ice. His legs were covered in bruises from repeated falls. He had been climbing for more than 14 hours in the death zone, where every breath contains 1/3 the oxygen of sea level. His body was consuming itself to stay alive. The search team found artifacts scattered around Mallory's body that revealed the final hours of the expedition. There was a tube of petroleum jelly, still usable after 75 years. There were letters from his wife, the ink still readable. There was a pocket knife, a pair of scissors, and a small tin of beef lozenges. But the most important items were missing: Andrew Irvine's body, the summit camera, and any proof that they had reached the top of the world. The mystery deepened when researchers analyzed the route Mallory and Irvine had taken toward the summit. They had chosen the most technically difficult path up the mountain, a route that modern climbers consider nearly impossible without fixed ropes and modern equipment. The route required them to climb a vertical rock face called the second step, a 40-foot cliff at 28,300 feet that had stopped every expedition since 1924. Chinese climbers had placed a metal ladder on the second step in 1975, but in 1924, it was considered unclimbable. In 2007, British climber Leo Holding attempted to climb the second step using the same equipment Mallory and Irvine had carried. He wore wool clothing, leather boots, and cotton gloves. He breathed through the same type of oxygen mask. He used the same ropes, the same ice axes, the same techniques. After 3 attempts, he declared the climb impossible with 1924 equipment. But Holding was a world-class rock climber in perfect physical condition. Mallory and Irvine had been exhausted, dehydrated, and running out of oxygen. The camera became the holy grail of mountaineering archaeology. Kodak experts confirmed that film exposed in 1924 would still be developable if it had been frozen continuously for 75 years. The images might be damaged, but they would be recoverable. If Mallory and Irvine had reached the summit, they would have photographed themselves there. The camera would contain the proof that they had conquered Everest 29 years before Hillary and Tenzing. But Andrew Irvine's body has never been found. Computer models suggest he fell into a crevasse or was buried by an avalanche. Ice movement on Everest means his body could be anywhere within a square mile of the summit. The camera went down with him, along with the answer to the greatest mystery in mountaineering history. Every year, the mountain moves a few inches, carrying Irvine deeper into the ice, further from discovery. The evidence suggests that Mallory and Irvine came closer to the summit than anyone had imagined. They climbed higher than any human had ever climbed before. They pushed the limits of what was physically possible with 1924 equipment. They died within 800 feet of the summit, closer than any climber would come for the next 29 years. But climbing Everest isn't about getting close to the summit. It's about getting to the summit and getting back down alive. The mountain keeps its secrets locked in ice and stone. George Mallory lies where he fell, his body slowly sinking into the permafrost. Andrew Irvine remains lost somewhere in the death zone, his camera still loaded with film that might prove they reached the summit first. The photograph of Ruth Mallory, his wife, might still be sitting on the summit of Everest, placed there by frozen fingers 75 years ago. Or it might be in his pocket, buried under tons of ice, waiting for the mountain to reveal its final secret. The weather on June 8, 1924, was perfect for climbing. The wind had died to nothing. The sky was crystal clear. The temperature was only 20 degrees below zero, warm by Everest standards. Mallory and Irvine left their high camp at 6:40 a.m., carrying 40 pounds of equipment each. They moved faster than any expedition had ever moved at that altitude. By 8 a.m., they were already at 27,000 feet, climbing without oxygen to conserve their supply for the final push. The route they chose was suicide. The North Col route required them to climb 3 massive rock steps, each one a technical challenge that would test world-class climbers today. The first step was a 60-foot cliff of loose rock and ice. The second step was a vertical 40-foot wall that required advanced rock climbing skills. The third step was a knife-edge ridge with 1,000-foot drops on both sides. Between each step, they had to traverse narrow ledges covered in loose rock that could give way at any moment. Mallory's previous attempts had taught him exactly where the dangers lay. In 1922, he had watched 7 Sherpas die in an avalanche because he had chosen the wrong route. The guilt had destroyed him. He drank heavily for months after returning to England. His wife found him crying in his study, staring at photographs of the dead men. He had promised their families he would bring them home safely. Instead, he had brought home their bodies wrapped in canvas. The oxygen equipment that Irvine had modified was revolutionary for its time, but primitive by modern standards. Each tank contained compressed air, not pure oxygen. The regulators were made of brass and leather, components that froze solid in extreme cold. The masks were designed for World War I fighter pilots, not mountain climbers. At 28,000 feet, the equipment provided roughly the same oxygen concentration as breathing normally at 15,000 feet. It was barely enough to keep a man conscious, let alone climbing. The psychological pressure on both men was crushing. The British Empire was watching. The king had personally wished them luck. The press had built them up as heroes who would conquer the last great challenge on Earth. Failure meant disgrace, bankruptcy, and the end of their climbing careers. Success meant immortality. They carried the weight of national pride along with their 40 pounds of equipment. The climbing conditions that morning were deceptively perfect. The mountain was calm, but that calmness was a trap. Everest's weather changes in minutes, not hours. A clear morning can become a killing storm by noon. The jet stream winds that normally tear across the summit at 200 miles per hour had shifted south, creating a brief window of opportunity. Mallory and Irvine knew they had perhaps 6 hours before the mountain turned deadly again. The physical deterioration both men experienced in the death zone was systematic and irreversible. Above 26,000 feet, the human body begins consuming its own muscle tissue for fuel. The brain swells, causing hallucinations and poor judgment. The blood thickens, making the heart work harder with each beat. The lungs fill with fluid, making every breath a struggle. Mallory and Irvine were essentially dying with each step they took higher. Odell's sighting at 12:50 p.m. was more significant than anyone realized at the time. He saw 2 figures moving upward near what he thought was the second step. But modern analysis of his position and the mountain's topography suggests he was actually looking at the first step, which meant Mallory and Irvine were running nearly 2 hours behind schedule. They should have been descending by that time, not still climbing upward. The artifacts found around Mallory's body in 1999 told a story of desperate improvisation. His goggles were wrapped with medical tape to prevent fogging. His boots were stuffed with newspaper for insulation. His gloves were darned with thread from his own clothing. These were the modifications of a man who had learned from previous failures and was determined not to fail again. Every piece of equipment had been personally tested and modified for the specific conditions of Everest. The rope that killed Mallory was a technological marvel in 1924. It was made of Italian hemp, twisted into a braided line that could theoretically hold 2,000 pounds. But hemp becomes brittle in extreme cold, and the rope had been exposed to temperatures of 40 degrees below zero for more than 12 hours. When Mallory fell, the rope snapped like a guitar string, sending him tumbling down the north face with no protection. The missing photograph of Ruth Mallory became a crucial piece of evidence. Before leaving for Everest, Mallory had promised his wife he would leave her picture on the summit as proof that he had reached the top. The photograph was not in his pockets when his body was found. Either he had left it on the summit, or it had been lost during his fall. The absence of the photograph was circumstantial evidence that he might have reached his goal. The search for Irvine's body became an obsession for generations of climbers. His remains could be anywhere in a debris field that covers several square miles. The mountain moves constantly, grinding ice and rock together, burying and exposing artifacts in an endless cycle. In 1960, Chinese climbers found a body at 27,230 feet that might have been Irvine, but they were forbidden from investigating further. The body was never seen again. The camera technology of 1924 was remarkably advanced for its time. The Vest. Pocket Kodak used roll film that was more stable than modern film. The camera was constructed entirely of metal and leather, materials that could survive extreme cold. Kodak engineers who examined identical cameras from the same era confirmed that film exposed in 1924 would still be developable if it had been continuously frozen. The images might be grainy and damaged, but they would be recoverable. The technical challenges of the second step were almost insurmountable with 1924 equipment. The cliff rises 40 feet straight up, with no handholds or footholds. Modern climbers use fixed ropes, metal ladders, and specialized equipment to overcome the obstacle. Mallory and Irvine had hemp ropes, metal pitons, and ice axes. The climb would have required exceptional skill, perfect conditions, and enormous physical strength at an altitude where men can barely stand upright. The timeline of their final day suggests they were pushing far beyond safe limits. They left camp at 6:40 a.m. and were still climbing upward at 12:50 p.m. This meant they had been in the death zone for more than 6 hours, burning through their oxygen supply and their physical reserves. Most modern climbers spend no more than 2 hours above 28,000 feet before beginning their descent. Mallory and Irvine were attempting something that bordered on suicide. The weather that trapped them was typical of Everest's deadly unpredictability. The clear morning gave way to clouds and wind by early afternoon. The temperature dropped to 50 degrees below zero. The wind increased to 100 miles per hour. These conditions would have made descent impossible even for experienced climbers. With modern equipment, Mallory and Irvine were trapped in the death zone with no shelter, no food, and rapidly depleting oxygen. The forensic analysis of Mallory's injuries revealed the brutal physics of his fall. His right leg was broken in 4 places, suggesting he had hit rocks multiple times during his tumble down the mountain. His ribs were shattered on the right side, indicating he had landed on his side with tremendous force. His skull was fractured, above the right eye, the injury that probably killed him. The damage pattern suggested he had fallen at least 2,000 feet, bouncing off rocks and ice walls before coming to rest. The preservation of Mallory's body was a miracle of high-altitude conditions. The constant freezing temperatures, low humidity, and thin air had mummified his remains naturally. His skin was bleached white but intact. His hair was still brown and well-groomed. His clothing was torn but recognizable. He looked like a man who had died yesterday, not 75 years ago. The mountain had turned him into a monument to human ambition. The search expeditions that followed became increasingly sophisticated and desperate. In 2004, climbers used metal detectors to scan the mountain's upper slopes. In 2010, they deployed ground-penetrating radar. In 2017, they used drone technology to photograph previously inaccessible areas. Each expedition found tantalizing clues, but never the definitive proof that Mallory and Irvine had reached the summit. The psychological impact of finding Mallory's body was profound for the climbing community. Here was a man who had become a legend, reduced to frozen flesh and bone on a remote mountainside. His death had been transformed into a romantic myth about human courage and determination. The reality was more brutal. He had died alone, in agony, far from home, pursuing a goal that might have killed him even if he had achieved it. The mystery of the camera continues to drive modern expeditions to Everest. The film inside might contain the most important photographs in mountaineering history. Images of Mallory and Irvine on the summit would rewrite the record books and vindicate the sacrifice of 2 men who died pursuing the impossible. The camera represents the difference between failure and triumph, between death and immortality. The mountain keeps its secrets locked in ice that never melts. George Mallory lies where he fell, his body slowly sinking into the permafrost that will preserve him for centuries. Andrew Irvine remains lost somewhere in the death zone, his camera still loaded with film that might prove they reached the summit first. The photograph of Ruth Mallory might still be sitting on the summit of Everest, placed there by frozen fingers in 1924, or it might be buried under tons of ice, waiting for the mountain to reveal its final secret. The truth about June 8, 1924, died with 2 men who pushed beyond the edge of human endurance to touch the roof of the world. They vanished into the death zone, but their camera rolled until the end, capturing images that might rewrite the history of mountaineering. The film is still up there, frozen in time, waiting for someone brave enough to retrieve it from the mountain that never gives up its dead.